Dr. Sarah Ross hurried down the main corridor of Mercy General Hospital, her mind torn between professional concerns and personal worries. Her brown hair was tightly pulled back into a bun, and her blue eyes revealed unwavering determination despite evident fatigue. Known for her dedication to patients, Sarah had a unique talent for soothing even the most nervous with a simple smile. But inside, she battled an emotional storm. Stopping briefly at the doctor's lounge for a sip of coffee, Sarah allowed herself to close her eyes for a few seconds, seeking a fragment of peace before facing the next emergency. Through the window, the torrential rain mirrored her tumultuous thoughts. The recent argument with her husband, Mark Mitchell, still echoed in her mind. Mark, her husband and a renowned surgeon, was in another wing of the hospital, finishing a complicated surgery. Mark, a man of imposing presence and steady hands, was admired for his surgical skill. His dark hair was slightly disheveled from the long shift, but his eyes remained focused. He was a master in his field, but the constant tension between his demanding career and marriage was beginning to take its toll. Sarah and Mark had met in medical school and together had built brilliant careers. Yet, the weight of their responsibilities was starting to overwhelm their relationship. Lately, their conversations had become monologues about work, interrupted only by heavy silences or quick arguments. Mark finished the surgery and made his way to the lounge, feeling the weight of another exhausting day. He found Sarah sitting with a cup of coffee, but her gaze was distant, lost in thought. He hesitated for a moment before approaching, trying to find the right way to start the conversation he knew was necessary. "Sarah, can we talk?" he asked, attempting to hide the weariness in his voice. Sarah looked up, surprised by his approach. "Of course, Mark. What is it?" Mark, choosing his words carefully, said, "I know things have been tough between us. Work is consuming everything, and it feels like we're losing each other." Sarah sighed, feeling the weight of his words. "I know, Mark, but I don't know how to change that. We're always here, always dealing with emergencies, always exhausted." Mark sat beside her, taking her hand. "We need to find a balance. We need to remember why we're together." Sarah looked at Mark's hands holding hers, and for a moment, she remembered their time in medical school, the dreams they shared, the promises of a life together. But those times felt so distant now, buried under the pressure of their responsibilities. Before they could continue the conversation, an urgent call echoed through the corridors, summoning them both to their respective duties. They exchanged a silent understanding of the reality of their lives. "Let's continue this conversation later," Sarah said, squeezing Mark's hand before standing up. "Yes, later," Mark replied as they headed in opposite directions, once again swallowed by the relentless pace of the hospital. The sound of rain outside was a constant reminder of the storm they faced, both inside and outside the hospital. Each was dedicated to saving lives, but they knew they would have to fight equally hard to save their marriage. As Sarah walked down the corridor, she thought ironically about being so effective at fixing hearts physically, yet feeling so powerless in healing her own. She sighed deeply and prepared for whatever came next, both in the operating room and in her personal life. She knew that somehow, she would need to find a way to balance the two worlds that constantly threatened to collide. The rain poured heavily over Mercy General Hospital as doctors and nurses faced another chaotic night. In the pediatric ICU, Dr. Sarah Ross moved with precision and urgency. She was urgently called to assess Jamie's case, a 15-year-old boy fighting for his life. Sarah entered the room and saw Jamie lying in bed, his pale skin contrasting with the white sheets. The monitors around the bed beeped frantically, each sound heightening the sense of urgency. She approached, her heart heavy at the sight of the boy's critical condition. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked the resident, picking up the medical chart. "Severe heart disease. He needs an urgent heart transplant," the resident replied, his voice tense. Sarah observed Jamie's pallor, the irregular heartbeat on the monitor, and dangerously low blood pressure. With steady hands, she performed an echocardiogram, confirming the severity of his heart failure. Each image on the monitor was a reminder of the fragility of the boy's life. With a lump in her throat, Sarah thought about how many lives were in her hands and the weight of that responsibility. As she worked, Mark Mitchell entered the room. He had been informed of Jamie's situation as soon as he finished his last surgery. "He's in bad shape," Sarah said, her voice laden with concern. "We need a heart transplant urgently." Mark nodded, his expression grave. "We'll do everything we can to get one." Focused on the critical situation, Sarah and Mark began discussing the available options. However, personal tensions soon emerged. Sarah discovered that Mark had made changes to treatment protocols without consulting her. "How could you change protocols without consulting me?" Sarah said, visibly irritated. Mark, trying to defend himself, replied, "I did what I thought was best for the patient." Sarah, raising her voice, countered, "And you think I'm incapable of making these decisions? We're here to work together, Mark." Frustrated, Mark shot back, "It's not about that, Sarah. We're always disagreeing about everything." The intensity of the moment made them both realize the depth of the frustrations that had been building up. Jamie's urgent case intertwined with the contained emotions of their troubled marriage. Sarah felt tears threatening, but she refused to let them fall. She needed to be strong, for Jamie's sake and for their relationship. As Sarah tried to find a solution to save Jamie, her mind drifted to flashbacks of happier times with Mark. She remembered the day they met in medical school, the nights studying together, the promises made on their wedding day. Those moments sharply contrasted with the coldness and distance that now existed between them. Sarah recalled Mark's smile on their wedding day, the promise to support each other through any circumstances. The reality, however, seemed increasingly distant from that promise. Jamie, lying in bed, was a constant reminder of the urgency and fragility of life. Every medical decision seemed to carry a double weight: Jamie's life and the health of their marriage. They knew they needed to find balance, but at that moment, saving Jamie was the absolute priority. "We need a heart for him, and fast," Sarah said, trying to focus on the task at hand. "We'll make calls, activate contacts. We'll do whatever it takes," Mark replied, determination returning to his face. The weight of their work, responsibilities, and personal sacrifices began to weigh heavily on both of them. Sarah felt the pressure of making life-or-death decisions while struggling to maintain her relationship. Mark, equally overwhelmed, tried to reconcile his love for surgery with the need to save their marriage. They moved through the ICU, coordinating efforts, calling organ banks, talking to specialists. The tension was palpable, but they continued to work together despite their differences. Jamie's life depended on it, and even with their marriage hanging by a thread, they knew that in that moment, they were an unbeatable team. The ICU was filled with sounds: the beeping of monitors, the muffled voices of doctors, the sound of rain outside. Sarah and Mark, both with heavy hearts, continued their fight. The challenge of saving Jamie mirrored their own struggle to save something equally precious: the love that once united them. As Sarah worked frantically, making calls to different organ banks, a flashback hit her. She remembered the first time she saw Mark operate, his impressive skill, the passion he put into every move. It was there that she fell in love with him, the man who dedicated his life to saving other lives. Reality brought Sarah back when a nurse entered the room. "Dr. Ross, there's an urgent call from the organ bank," the nurse said. Sarah exchanged a meaningful glance with Mark before answering the phone. Jamie's hopes of survival depended on that call, just as their hopes of saving their own hearts depended on finding a way back to the love they shared. Finally, the news of a compatible donor reached Mercy General Hospital. Sarah and Mark received the information with a mix of relief and tension. The available heart belonged to a teenager who had been in a car accident. However, the donor's father was hesitant to allow his son's organs to be donated, still in shock from the sudden loss. Sarah and Mark glanced at each other, knowing they needed to work together, setting aside their personal differences to persuade the donor's father. They walked together to the waiting room, where the man sat, his face marked by grief and confusion. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with sadness and uncertainty. The room was silent except for the distant sound of rain hitting the windows and the hurried steps of nurses in the corridor. Sarah began to speak, her voice gentle yet firm, trying to find the right words for such a delicate situation. "Mr. Johnson, we are the doctors in charge of your son's case," she said, kneeling beside him. "We understand this is an incredibly difficult time for you." The donor's father, Mr. Johnson, looked up with tear-filled eyes. He seemed lost, unable to process the magnitude of what was happening. "My son is still here. I can't let him go," he replied, his voice trembling. Sarah gently held his hand, the contact a gesture of comfort, an attempt to establish a human connection amidst overwhelming grief. "I know it's hard, but your son has the chance to save many lives. He can continue living through these people," Sarah said, her eyes filled with compassion. Mark stepped closer, feeling the need to support Sarah and strengthen their argument. He knew they needed to be careful but also persuasive. "Mr. Johnson, we don't make this request lightly. The decision to donate is yours, but we want you to know that your generosity can give others a new chance at life," Mark said, trying to be firm yet compassionate. Mr. Johnson looked at them, his pain palpable. He was in a terrible inner conflict, torn between love for his lost son and the possibility of giving hope to other families. "My son is still breathing," Mr. Johnson exclaimed, almost shouting. "How can I make this decision? He could wake up, he could come back to us." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the moment. "I know it seems impossible, but the tests show there is no brain activity anymore. I know it's hard to accept, but your son is no longer truly here." Mr. Johnson shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I can't believe this. He was fine this morning. How can this be real?" Mark, trying to be both firm and compassionate, added, "We understand your pain, but think about the lives he could save. Think about how he could live on through these people." "You don't understand," Mr. Johnson cried out, desperate. "He's my only son. How can I just let him go?" Sarah, tears in her eyes, continued, "Think about the mothers and fathers who are waiting for a miracle, just like you. The pain you're feeling now, they feel too, but with the hope that someone like you can offer a second chance to their children." Mr. Johnson ran his hand over his face, trying to process everything. The silence in the waiting room was interrupted only by muffled sobs and the distant sound of nurses' footsteps. "I know it seems impossible," Sarah said, her voice full of empathy, "but you can turn this tragedy into something positive. Your son's legacy can be the lives of many others." Mark stepped even closer, his tone urgent. "We're racing against time, Mr. Johnson. Every minute counts. Jamie, a 15-year-old boy, needs this heart to live. He's the same age as your son. Please consider this." Mr. Johnson, visibly shaken, tried to find strength in Sarah and Mark's words. He was torn between hopelessness and the possibility of doing something meaningful with his son's loss. "I can't," he murmured, his voice broken by emotion. Sarah, gripping his hand more firmly, said, "We understand this is the hardest decision anyone can make, but know that by allowing donation, your son will be remembered as a hero, someone who gave others a chance to live." Mark nodded, adding, "Think about how he could be remembered, not by the tragedy, but by the lives he gave to others." The conversation was fraught with emotion, with tears and heartfelt pleas. Mr. Johnson closed his eyes, taking deep breaths, trying to find clarity amidst the pain. In the height of the drama, Mr. Johnson finally agreed, motivated by the idea that his son's death could bring life to others. "If it means he can live on in some way, then I agree," he said, his voice broken by emotion. Sarah and Mark, still shaken by the intensity of the conversation, exchanged a meaningful glance before preparing for the surgery. They felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that Mr. Johnson's sacrifice would give Jamie and other patients a new chance at life. Sarah and Mark, along with a team of specialists, entered the operating room to perform the transplant. The tension in the room was palpable. Every movement was critical. The lights shone brightly over the surgical table as Sarah began the incision. The room was silent except for the sounds of monitors and the murmuring of instructions. Sarah, adjusting the instruments, was completely focused on the operation, But Mr. Johnson's face, marked by pain, continued to haunt her. She thought about the courage it took for him to allow his son's organs to be donated and felt the weight of responsibility with every move she made. "I'm removing the damaged heart," Sarah said, her voice firm yet gentle, as she carefully proceeded with the removal. Mark was by her side, ready to assist. His eyes fixed on the surgical field, he passed instruments and offered support. His hands steady, but his gaze filled with concern and hope. "Everything looks good so far," Mark confirmed, keeping the team synchronized. The medical team was focused, each member playing their role with precision. Sarah knew every second was crucial and that there could be no room for error. As she worked, she thought about the silent promise she had made to Mr. Johnson that his sacrifice would not be in vain. The new heart was brought in carefully and prepared for transplant. Sarah allowed herself a brief moment to take a deep breath before starting the most delicate part of the procedure. The silence in the operating room was absolute, every team member attentive to their roles. "We're starting the anastomosis," Sarah announced, referring to the connection of blood vessels to the new heart. Suddenly, an alarm started blaring. Jamie's heart monitor showed a sharp drop in vital signs. His heart had stopped. "Cardiac arrest," Mark shouted, urgency clear in his voice. "Adrenaline now." The team sprang into frantic action. Sarah began chest compressions while a nurse prepared the adrenaline injection. Time seemed to slow down as they fought to revive Jamie. "Come on, Jamie, don't leave us now," Sarah murmured, sweat trickling down her forehead. "Mark, we need to stabilize him." Mark administered the adrenaline injection while Sarah continued the compressions. The tense silence in the room was broken only by the sounds of monitors and urgent medical instructions. "Charge to 200, Sarah said, preparing the defibrillator. "Clear." She applied the shock, watching the monitor anxiously. Nothing. Tension mounted with each passing second. "Charge to 300, Sarah ordered, her determination unwavering. "Come on, Jamie. You can do this." Another shock was delivered. The monitor still showed flat lines. Sarah felt a lump in her throat but didn't give up. "One more time. Charge to 360, Mark said, his voice firm. "Clear." The third shock was administered, and this time the monitor showed signs of life. Jamie's heart began beating again, weak but present. The room erupted in sighs of relief. "He's back," Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion. "Keep monitoring. We need to finalize the anastomosis." The medical team worked with renewed determination, knowing they had overcome a significant adversity. Sarah and Mark were more synchronized than ever, each movement precise and calculated. Finally, the new heart was connected and functioning. The monitor showed regular heartbeats, and color returned to Jamie's face. "Good job, everyone," Mark said, smiling at the team. "Jamie is stable." Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Johnson. Is he okay? How is he coping with all of this? She wondered. His tear-filled eyes continued to haunt her. After the surgery, while Jamie was recovering, Sarah and Mark met in the doctor's rest area. Exhaustion was evident on their faces, but there was also a glimmer of hope. "We did something incredible today," Sarah said, sitting beside Mark. Mark nodded, a faint smile forming. "Yes, we did, but this is just the beginning." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with conflicting emotions. "We need to talk about us. We've been ignoring this for too long." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Sarah. I've been difficult, but that's no excuse. We need help." Sarah squeezed his hand, a gesture of connection. "We can't go on like this. We have to find a way to reconnect, to remember why we chose this life together." Mark looked into her eyes, seriousness in his expression. "I'm willing to try. Let's figure out a way to deal with this, whatever it takes." Sarah nodded, feeling a lightness in her heart. "I am too. Today reminded me of how good we are together, both as doctors and as partners." Mark squeezed her hand back, a silent promise that they would fight together. "We'll overcome this, Sarah, one step at a time." They knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to try. Jamie's successful surgery was a reminder that even in the toughest moments, they could make a difference. And now it was time to apply that determination to their own relationship. Sarah, still thinking about Mr. Johnson, felt a renewed determination. If that man could make such a sacrifice, she and Mark could find a way to save their marriage. Facing their problems together was a new beginning, a chance to heal not just the physical wounds of their patients but also the emotional wounds in their own lives. The future was uncertain, but together, they were ready to face it. Jamie began to show signs of recovery, his eyes slowly opening as his hopeful parents stood by his bedside. Monitors around him displayed positive signs, and color had returned to his face. Sarah and Mark entered the room to check on his progress. Jamie's mother, tears streaming down her face, tightly held Sarah's hand. "Dr. Ross, we have no words to thank you. You saved our son." Her voice choked with emotion. Equally moved, Jamie's father gripped Mark's hand. "Dr. Mitchell, you and your team gave our son a new lease on life. We are eternally grateful." Feeling the weight of the moment, Sarah smiled gently. "Jamie is a strong boy. He will make a full recovery. We're glad we could help." Mark nodded, his expression filled with understanding and gratitude. "You've all been incredibly brave through this whole process. It made all the difference." Sarah looked at Jamie, observing his peaceful breathing and relaxed face. She felt deep relief and immense gratitude for the surgery's success. It was all worth it, she thought. Jamie's story brought a sense of hope throughout the hospital. Nurses and doctors passing by his room smiled at the signs of recovery. Other patients and their families also felt a wave of optimism, seeing that medical miracles were possible. In the break room, Sarah and Mark were greeted by their colleagues with words of support and recognition. "You've done an amazing job," said one nurse, smiling. "Jamie's recovery has brought a new energy to all of us." Another doctor, Dr. Thompson, approached Sarah and Mark. "This victory meant a lot to all of us. You've inspired the whole team." Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance, feeling the weight of the past weeks beginning to lift. Despite their professional success, they knew they needed to take care of themselves. Then, Sarah received a message saying that the father of the teenager who donated the heart was at the hospital and wanted to speak with her and Jamie's parents. Moved, Sarah invited everyone to a small private room. There, Mr. Johnson, the donor's father, waited with eyes full of sadness and hope. Mr. Johnson began, his voice trembling. "I wanted to meet you, to know that my son's heart is beating inside another young man. It brings me some comfort." Jamie's mother, still holding her son's hand, looked at Mr. Johnson with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Johnson, we can never thank you enough. Your decision saved our son. He will live because of your sacrifice." Jamie, awakening, looked at his mother and then at Mr. Johnson. "Mom, who is this?" His mother smiled, tears streaming down her face. "This is the man whose son saved your life, Jamie. He gave you a second chance." Jamie, still weak, reached out to Mr. Johnson. "Thank you for giving me a chance to live." Mr. Johnson held Jamie's hand, his voice choked with emotion. "You just need to live a full and happy life, Jamie. That's all I ask." Touched by the scene, Mark added, "Mr. Johnson, your generosity in a moment of such pain is an inspiration to all of us. We all feel the depth of your sacrifice." Sarah, with tears in her eyes, said, "Your son is a hero, Mr. Johnson. He saved Jamie and brought hope to all of us." The room fell silent for a moment, everyone feeling the weight and beauty of that sacrifice. Mr. Johnson, tears streaming down, looked at everyone and said, "Seeing Jamie alive and well, it helps me cope with my loss. Thank you for taking care of my son, even after his passing." Emotion filled the room, and everyone felt the profound connection that united them. Words were not enough to express the gratitude, pain, and hope they all shared. Sarah and Mark, inspired by Mr. Johnson's strength and generosity, vowed to do everything they could to honor that sacrifice. As they walked down the hallway, leaving the hospital, Sarah held Mark's hand. "We need to make time for ourselves, to really focus on us." Mark nodded, fully agreeing. Yes, we do. Let's find a way to make that work. In the following days, Sarah and Mark worked hard to balance their demanding careers with the need to reconnect. They started setting aside small moments together, like quick lunches or walks in the hospital park. Each small gesture was a step in the right direction, a reminder that their relationship needed nurturing as much as their patients did. One night, while reviewing charts in the break room, Mark looked at Sarah and said, "We need to keep this up, finding time for us. Maybe we should consider professional help, someone who can guide us through this process." Sarah agreed, feeling a surge of hope. "I think that would be a good idea. We can look for a therapist who understands our schedule." They knew the journey would be long and challenging, but they were determined to find balance. Jamie's successful surgery was a constant reminder that, with determination and mutual support, they could overcome any obstacle. As they walked down the hallway contemplating a moment for themselves, they were urgently called to another severe and complex case, an industrial accident leaving several victims with serious trauma and burns. Both headed towards the new challenge with renewed determination. If you want to hear the story of Sarah Ross and Mark Mitchell's new challenge, leave it in the comments and we will attend and make the new story. If you enjoyed this emotional story, don't forget to like the video and leave your comment about our story. We want to hear your opinion. And to not miss any of our future episodes, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. That way, you'll always be the first to know when a new story airs. Thank you for watching.